Okay, welcome back. Part 2 of Crawford's essay is called The Psychic Appeal of Manual Work, and as we look at this title, we want to think about what does he mean by psychic. The root is Greek. Psyche means brain, intellect, mind. So the psychic appeal would be, how does something appeal to one's mind, to one's intellect, to one's thinking? So the psychic appeal of manual work, Crawford is here making the case that manual work requires brain power and that creates interest for a person. And he gives us, once again, he starts very specific. He gives us an example of himself at age 14 as an electrician's helper. And he talks about one case that he wants to make is that one gets self-esteem by being able to finish something with one's hands and then see the final product, which is perhaps not the same satisfaction one gets during, say, a school year or a school semester, not quite knowing all the time whether or not something is good. But if you're an electrician and you flick a switch and the lights come on, you know that you did it right. So the accomplishment is obvious. In the physical world, accomplishments are obvious and something that one can take pleasure in. And he also gives us a second example of being a kind of a journeyman on the job, not the expert, not the master. And as an apprentice, shall we say, he saw something that startled him because it was so beautifully done, so aesthetically pleasing. The conduit, the electrical conduit, and the way that the wiring was all brought together in these beautiful curves. And it was so far beyond his own abilities, he felt he was in the presence of some genius. Okay, so again, a way in which someone who does manual labor has something that lasts beyond him. Maybe not the Colosseum per se, or the Wall of China, but it stays in the physical world, and it's something that people can see. And then he quotes Alexandre Koyev. The man who works recognizes his own product in the world that has actually been transformed by his work. Yes. I had a grandfather who worked for the WPA. He built bridges. I imagine that upon finishing his labor, he could stand back and say, that was mine, and know about people crossing that bridge every day and benefiting from his labor. He recognizes himself in it. He sees in it his own human reality. In it, he discovers and reveals to others the objective reality of his humanity, which is to say, his work shows who he is as a human being. And it's an objective reality because everybody sees it and everybody sees it the same. Everybody sees the height of it, the breadth of it, the weight of it, and what it does, what its function is. It's obvious to everyone in the world. In it, he discovers and reveals to others the objective reality of his humanity, of the originally abstract and purely subjective idea he has of himself. Okay, which goes to identity, right? A person can take pride in himself or herself as a maker when he or she has built something that lives in the world. He talks about the satisfactions of manifesting oneself concretely in the world through manual competence, which is to say that everybody can see that you've built something and that it works. They seem to relieve him of the felt need to offer chattering interpretations of himself to vindicate his worth. What is he saying here? The chattering. He's suggesting, I think, that perhaps people who can't be sure of what their accomplishments are, if their accomplishments are ghostly, are virtual, are not apparent to people in the world, that person might feel a bit anxious, a bit nervous, a bit neurotic about himself and who he is, because what he accomplishes is not available in the world to be observed, to be praised or even criticized. Someone who makes something in the world can simply point. The building stands, the car runs, the lights are on. Doesn't have to boast because his work is right there. Boasting is what a boy does. So he is associating manual labor with masculinity here, pretty obviously. Man, boy. A boy has no real effect in the world. A man should have a real effect in the world. Craftsmanship, and suddenly the word man in craftsmanship seems to stand out because of his emphasis on the male gender. His craftsmanship must reckon with the infallible judgment of reality, where one's failures and shortcomings cannot be interpreted away, suggesting here somebody whose work does not appear to be real can rationalize anything, can say anything about it, which is a kind of, say, boasting on the one hand, and on the other hand, making excuses when his work is not good. Okay, and now we've made a shift from work to hobby, which is a different thing. So, hobbyists will tell you that making one's own furniture is hard to justify economically. So this is a pretty big shift in topic. And what does he mean by that? Making one's own furniture is hard to justify economically. Well, if you can go to a store and you can buy a chair and you can spend 25 bucks on it, or even 120 bucks on it, that cost was bought with a downgrading of labor. That's why it's so cheap. You try to make your own. Where do you get the wood for it? Where do you get the metal for it? How do you make it? What tools do you need? The expense of everything that it takes to go into furniture making. If you don't already have it, if it's not something you do all the time, but you just bought on a lark, or you just thought, hey, I want to make a dining room table, and it's not something you do all the time, you got to buy all those tools, and you got to buy all those raw materials. You got to make a plan, and you got to figure out how to do it, and then you have to spend the time. And the time can be a lot if it's not something you do every day, as opposed to someone who makes furniture all the time might be able to make a large and impressive piece of furniture in a week or less. So there's an enormous expense. You can't excuse making furniture by saying it's going to be cheaper to make your chair than it's going to be to go down to Sears or any place else and just buy one, or order one online, frankly. That's cheaper. So it's not an economical thing. But I think he's suggesting something else. Making one's own furniture, just the idea of it, right? Doesn't that sound kind of sexy? Maybe that's just me, but no, I think it's Crawford2. And yet they persist. Hobbyists may make their own furniture, or something that they use or want in their homes. Shared memories attached to souvenirs of our lives, right? If you've made a cabinet, if you've made a bookshelf, if you've made a chair, and it lives in your life, it lives in your house, and people use it, memories start to be attached to that, and people start to think, oh, my brother made this, right? Or my dad made this. Here I go using masculine terms again. Maybe my mom made this. Okay. Material souvenirs are of our lives. So they begin to have some kind of importance to us emotionally that they wouldn't have if we bought it at a store. And producing them as a kind of a communion with others and with the future. Why? Because a piece of furniture, if it's a good piece of furniture, my goodness, it should last at least one generation, at least one lifetime. If it's a good piece of furniture, I've seen pieces of furniture that are hundreds of years old. Not a lot of them, and not in this country. But a good piece of furniture, it can be something that lasts. Okay. But he decided at one point to make a mahogany table for himself. And he's talking about how he imagined the impressions that his future child would have. He didn't have children, but, thinking about the defects in its execution, if maybe there's a scratch someplace, or the stain is uneven, or maybe one leg happens not to be quite the same length as the others if it's got a little tip to it. The defects in its execution, as well as, the inevitable stains. The child might remember spilling grape juice or mom's coffee and remember the moment when this happened. It becomes a surface textured enough that memory and sentiment might cling to it in unnoticed accretions. So something that is made, by hand. It has a certain value to it that other things just don't. I have actually a hunting knife. My grandfather made it. I'm never letting that thing go. More fundamentally, the durable objects of use produced by men, here we go, men again, give rise to the familiarity of the world, its customs and habits of intercourse, interactions between men and things. And he's quoting the one of the most famous philosophers of the 20th century, Hannah Arendt, who wrote actually quite memorably about World War II, the Holocaust, how it happened and what that meant about us as human beings. But here, Hannah Arendt is apparently just talking about the familiarity of the physical world. And Hannah Arendt goes on to say, the reality and reliability of the human world rest primarily on the fact that we are surrounded by things more permanent than the activity by which they were produced. And it is a good idea sometimes. Even in Fresno, there are places you can go where there are older things. The downtown area, buildings that were built in the 1960s, in the 1940s, in the 1920s, and maybe even before.